The walls are closing in on Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. The pressure is starting to really build, and it's starting to actually take action in his responses. And you see, he's becoming but you got to be honest with it, perhaps more and more unrealistic about what he's facing, and it's starting to show. And to try to make some sense out of some of this, and I mean, I don't want to be, so much of a "I told you so," but John Mearsheimer's been calling a lot of this from the outset, actually for many years before even the war started. We'll just go back to that far. But certainly a lot of the things that you've been saying is playing out. And first of all, just welcome back to the show, John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny. I'm glad to be here.
Well, listen, I mean, for Volodymyr Zelensky, it's not looking that great, but I think that in terms of finding a way to end this war, I think things are starting to look up a little bit. And I think we're starting to see the parameters maybe of what this is going to look like. And I want to start off with Zelensky here because I really think that he's starting to feel a little bit desperate. Some of the things that new Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said earlier today, some things that Trump has been saying lately, is starting to make it pretty clear that this deal's coming to an end quicker than it has been. You see that one right there from The Economist, where Donald Trump is keeping Ukraine president out of the loop, and he's worried about stuff. And some of his statements are getting even more disconnected from reality, if that's even possible. But one of just a couple recent examples was, he says, "Hey, look, I'm looking to get maybe some minerals for Donald Trump. I want to give him a bunch of minerals. We'll give him $500 million of that." And one of the more interesting ones here recently that he said to the Russian side is, "Hey, I tell you what, I'm willing to give you Kursk back in exchange for something." And that has received an interesting and not at all surprising view from Moscow. Here's how France 24 captured those two things.
A few months ago, right before the U.S. election, Zelensky had said that Ukraine was not willing to make any territorial concessions, regardless of the U.S. election result. And now you have Donald Trump in power. Since then, Zelensky started talking about temporarily maybe ceding some territory to Russia in exchange for joining NATO. And now, finally, openly, he says, we are willing to talk about a land swap. He's talking about something very specific. He says that he's willing to give Russia back the Russian land that Ukraine controls right now in the Kursk region. The Russians are not even talking about what type of territory they would cede. They're simply saying, we're not going to entertain that discussion. The Kremlin response came today with Dmitry Peskov, who is the spokesperson for the Kremlin. He said about the land swap, that is impossible. Russia has never and will never discuss the topic of exchanging any of its territory.
What do you make of that transition she talked about of Zelensky, really even in the last 6 weeks, a pretty significant shift?
Well, I think that Zelensky sees the writing on the wall. I mean, there are two things happening here from Zelensky's point of view. One is the situation on the battlefield is continuing to deteriorate, and the Ukrainians have no way to fix that problem. The second thing that has happened is that Donald Trump got elected, and Trump wants to basically shut down the Ukraine war. He's not interested in supporting Ukraine anymore. He'd like the Europeans to do it if anybody does it. And Zelensky surely understands that without robust American support, there's no way that Ukraine can survive over the long term in this fight against the Russians. The Russians will win on the battlefield. He is now realizing that, and he's looking for a way out. The problem is that he and Trump can't find a way out because they're unwilling to accept Russian conditions.
And those Russian conditions, which Sergei Ryabkov just reiterated a couple of days ago, is everything that Trump said in June, on June 14th of last summer, where it was all the 4 administrative borders, the 4 provinces that they annexed. It's the no NATO, it's a neutrality status, and then it's also, and these are, I think, some of the more thorny parts here, the issue of uh, demilitarization, and, as the Russians define it, denazification. He says all of those conditions will be necessary. He's saying that, and certainly Sergei Lavrov has reiterated recently, that they're not willing to give on any of those. Can Russia enter into these negotiations and be firm on all of those points?
Well, I think it'll be firm on the first three. The Russians are going to insist that the West and Ukraine accept the fact that those four oblasts in the east, plus Crimea, have been formally annexed by Russia and they're now Russian territory. Second, the Russians will not cave on the whole issue of Ukraine in NATO. And that includes de facto membership as well as de jure membership. All this talk about security guarantees to Ukraine from the United States and from the West more generally is just another way of talking about de facto NATO expansion. That's not happening. And with regard to demilitarization, the third demand, I think that the Russians are going to demand, as they did in the Istanbul discussions in March, April 2022, that Ukraine's military capability be greatly limited. The fourth condition, which is denazification, I think that's one that they won't press hard on because that involves regime change in Ukraine. And to really make that work, they would have to conquer all of Ukraine. And I don't think the Russians have an appetite for that.
And let's look at perhaps some other ways to achieve that outcome, and that is through elections, because the Kremlin has been very adamant and repeated here lately. It's all the way up to Putin himself in public comments that he can negotiate with Zelensky, but he won't sign any agreement with Zelensky because he views him as an illegitimate leader because he went past his term of service and no new elections are even on the table at this point. How serious do you think Russia will push that issue to get to a final settlement, and would the Ukraine side do it?
Well, I think that the Russians are now dug in that they won't negotiate with Zelensky, and I think that there will probably be elections in Ukraine, and Zelensky will lose or not run, and you'll get a new Ukrainian leader. The question is, who is that new Ukrainian leader going to be? Is it going to be some reasonable individual who the Putin forces in the Kremlin feel they can deal with? Or is it going to be somebody who they identify as a Nazi or a fascist or someone who looks a lot like Zelensky? And if that happens, what are the Russians going to do? So I don't think, we can tell for sure what the end result of an election will be. And in the final analysis, I don't think it matters that much. I think what really matters to the Russians are their first three demands as you described them.
And so that leaves the United States in a bit of a sticky wicket, so to speak. If Trump's coming in and thinking he's going to have some leverage to negotiate some things that are in any way positive to the Ukraine side, but Russia is not willing to bend on any of their points, then it seems that the only course left for Russia, as Colonel Jacques Beau said on our show a few days ago, is to just keep fighting. Like he said he believes, and I wanted to get your view on this. He believes that these negotiations will be conducted by the Russians similar to how the Istanbul agreements work. They had a deal on the table. The Russians would have been willing to agree to it, but when it was rejected, they simply just continued the fighting on forward until they achieved their objectives on the ground. Do you see something similar working out in this dynamic?
Yes. I mean, I don't think you're going to get an agreement. And I think it's because the West and Ukraine will not agree to Russia's main demands. And absent agreement on those main demands, you're not going to negotiate an end to the conflict. And that means that the conflict will go on. And from a Russian point of view, this is hardly the end of the world because the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield. And what they will do is continue to move westward. And they will hope that at some time in the not too distant future, the Ukrainian forces in front of them collapse and they can capture even more territory. I think the big issue here is not whether the Russians annex these four oblasts that they now basically control, and Crimea. I think the interesting question is whether they end up annexing other oblasts, places like Odessa and Kharkiv as well. I would like to see, for the Ukrainians' sake, that not happen. But the more this war goes on, the more likely it is that the Ukrainians will lose more territory than they've already lost.
Well, in fact, Russia is just now just a handful of miles away from another province, Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk, it's called, I think, in the Ukraine side. And so that could, a new one could come into play literally within days or weeks if the fighting continues on forward. But I want to look at a couple of specific things that the Ukraine side, when it comes in terms of what negotiations could be and what the West is trying to get. And I wonder if you can comment on what the Russians may say to them and whether there's any room for negotiating here. We'll look at a few of them. One of the ones is that both Zelensky has been talking about recently, Pete Hegseth talked about also today in his comments, is the issue of peacekeepers. You have Zelensky said, hey, I want 200,000 peacekeepers to monitor whatever happens in between here. And here's what Hegseth had to say about that.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Okay, I'm glad he's saying there's going to be no U.S. troops involved. I'm glad he's expressly saying Article 5 will not apply to this. But from the Russian perspective, are they going to allow any number of international troops at the line of contact?
Well, I think here, Danny, you have to distinguish between deploying troops during a ceasefire and deploying troops in a permanent settlement. And most people who talk about deploying NATO troops in Ukraine talk about it in the context of a ceasefire. And if any NATO troops are put in Ukraine during a ceasefire, I think that what will happen is those troops will eventually be attacked when the ceasefire breaks down. And in fact, I would argue the Russians will not even allow those NATO troops to come in to Ukraine in the context of a ceasefire. It's just going to be unacceptable to them. And if we insist and those NATO troops come in, even if they're just European troops, it seems to me the ceasefire will either not happen or break down, and the Russians will go after those troops, as they should. With regard to a genuine peace agreement and security guarantees, I do not believe the Russians are going to allow NATO or the Europeans to station troops in Ukraine. I'm not even sure they're going to allow them to give a security guarantee. Or if they do allow the Europeans to give a security guarantee, there'll be all sorts of caveats attached to that. You want to remember that from the Russian point of view, what this war is all about is Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And a lot of these proposals about stationing European or NATO troops in Ukraine and security guarantees and so forth and so on is, in effect, a de facto way of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that's not going to happen. From a Russian point of view, Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral country, period.
And let's look at that a little bit more. I'm going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. This issue of security guarantees, because it seems to always come up. Zelensky, of course, has been talking about it ad nauseum for years, not even just recently. And you heard Secretary Hegseth say it again right there. But what is the pros and cons for any European country, whether it's into bilateral or any kind of multilateral engagement, towards providing a security guarantee? What would that even mean? Because to me, a security guarantee sounds like I'm willing to use my troops and whatever else to guarantee yours, i.e., I'll go to war for you, almost like a different kind of Article 5. How do you see the different interpretations of what security guarantees mean to the West?
Well, you could argue that a security guarantee does not mean that European or NATO troops actually engage in the fighting, that they, in effect, do in a future conflict what they have done in this war that has run since 2022. And that is that they provide all sorts of material and economic support for Ukraine, but NATO troops or European troops don't fight inside of Ukraine for Ukraine. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that those European or NATO troops actually fight on behalf of Ukraine. I think it's extremely unlikely that the Europeans would make that commitment. We're not going to make that commitment. And I think that, in effect, what's going on here is you're not going to get a meaningful security guarantee from the West to come to Ukraine's rescue if the war breaks out again. And what that means is you're going to end up with a genuinely neutral Ukraine.
And in some of these countries where they've had neutrality, I think the Austrian State Treaty, I think, is one that's mentioned a number of times. Some of the other countries in, I can't remember which one it was, not Sweden, but
Finland.
Finland. Yeah, those two, Finland and Austria. I mean, they were neutral countries, but did they also have security guarantees from other countries?
No, Finland and Austria were both genuinely neutral countries during the Cold War. And there was no way we were going to give them a security guarantee, in large part because they were, in effect, in the Russian sphere of influence, or what was then the Soviet sphere of influence. And that would not have made sense. In the same way that we, excuse me, did not go in support of the Hungarians in 1956, or go in support of the Czechs in 1968. That would have been crazy. And the same is true with regard to giving Austria a security guarantee or Finland a security guarantee.
And so why isn't it in the interest of Europe to apply that same model here and say, look, your best security guarantee is just not to pose a threat to Russia. Be neutral. We won't enter into there, and that will by itself lower the risk that Europe or that Russia would ever invade again, as the fear it goes.
That makes perfect sense to you, and it makes perfect sense to me. But for some reason, it doesn't make perfect sense to the vast majority of security experts in the West.
And what do you attribute that to? Because I can't come up with a logical reason why they would not want to go down that path and cling to another one, which is illogical.
It's, I think, basically a sunk costs argument. I mean, so many people in the West have devoted so many years and so much effort to making the argument that it is imperative that we support Ukraine now and forever, that they simply find it impossible to back off from that way of thinking about the Ukraine situation. And of course, it's tragic, especially for the Ukrainians, because this is not in their interest. But the fact is that if you look at the foreign policy elite in the United States and in most countries in Western Europe, they are filled with people who are profoundly committed to Ukraine.
And help my brain get around this, because I'm trying to think as a rational person who has a strong preference for the outcome you just articulated, that many in the West do, for the reasons that you just argued. But I can still, in my mind, say, even if I held those positions, it would be irrational for me to continue to hold them when it is self-evident that continuing to pursue my preferred outcome will actually deprive the Ukraine side of the security that I want them to have. And in fact, if it goes far enough, could deprive them of their independence at all.
Well, I mean, there are cracks in the edifice. I think what you're saying is it's surprising that people haven't woken up more quickly. You know, it's what's taking them so long.
Yeah, I guess so.
And I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I look, I don't understand Western strategic thinking on Ukraine or on the Middle East. It just escapes me. If you think, from my point of view, if you start to think about what is in the American national interest, a lot of what we do does not make sense to me. and I know you share my views on Ukraine, but that's just the way it is.
Well, that's just that. Okay. I mean, that I can't really argue with because I can see it on the ground. It's playing out that way. All right. So if 200,000 peacekeepers is one of the things that Zelensky's wanting, one of the other things he said on Piers Morgan's, where you have made a number of appearances, he added this little jewel of it would be swell if this was the case.
Will we be given nuclear weapons? Then let them give us nuclear weapons. Will they give us the missiles in the quantities that we can stop Russia? And I'm not sure of that, but I think it would help. Otherwise, what missiles can stop Russia's nuclear missiles? That is a rhetoric question. So let's do it the following way: give us back nuclear arms, give us missile systems, partners, help us finance the 1 million army, move your contingent on the parts of our state where we want the stability of the situation so that the people have tranquility.
Of course, stability and tranquility are definitely going to happen if we give Volodymyr Zelensky nuclear weapons. I mean, if this was a skit on Saturday Night Live, that would be more plausible. But this was said seriously. What do you make of that?
It's desperation. I mean, he's desperate. The idea that Russia and the United States, and in fact, almost every European country, would allow Ukraine to have nuclear weapons at this point in time is, in my opinion, unthinkable. The Russians will not let it happen. We will not let it happen. It is not in our interest for Ukraine to have nuclear weapons because Ukraine will probably use those weapons and drag us into a nuclear war. And that we don't want. So this is just not going to happen. And, he can demand that we give him more missiles and other forms of conventional weaponry. But as has been clear for at least a year now, there's nothing in the cupboard. It's not like we can just open the door of the cupboard, pull out all these weapons, start shipping them to Ukraine, and that will solve all their problems. And furthermore, as we all know at this point in time, the main problem is not weaponry, it's manpower. And they don't have the manpower. And the Russians do have the manpower. And all of this is to say that Ukraine is in deep, deep trouble. And Zelensky recognizes that. And he's flailing around making wild statements about nuclear weapons because he really has nothing else he can do.
And you have to wonder, will there come a point? I was going to say at what point, but will there come a point to where a number of other Western powers, and we'll just stick with the main ones, the UK, France, and Germany especially, will they say, wow, these things are starting to get, these comments from Zelensky are starting to get so outrageous that we have to start asking this hard question. Can Zelensky be a rational actor and negotiate something away? We keep saying no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine, but Professor, will there come a point to where we have to say, I'm not sure that he can be a rational actor. We may have to negotiate without him.
Well, that may be true. It's hard to know what Western leaders are thinking on this issue. I mean, I believe there's a more important issue than Zelensky. The question is the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, willing to accept Putin's key demands and cut a deal? You have to start there. And if the answer is yes, that we're willing to cut the deal, we're willing to recognize the Russian annexation of these 4 oblasts plus Crimea, we're willing to accept the fact that Ukraine will be a neutral country, then we can worry about Ukraine. But there's no point in worrying about Ukraine when we can't even agree on the basic Russian demands. So there's just no deal on the table, independent of Ukraine. So I think that worrying about Zelensky doesn't matter very much.
Well, it's hard to argue with that one. So one other thing I wanted to look at specifically to get your views on. So if there was the issue of giving back Kursk, if there was the issue of 200,000 peacekeepers or nuclear weapons, the last thing is about Zelensky saying, hey, how about this? How about I just give you $500 billion, Donald Trump, of our mineral wealth? and then that will help us get peace. But this is actually what he said. And in fact, in response to that, Trump a few days ago had an interview with Bret Baier where he said this.
I know you want a Ukraine-Russia peace deal, but how do you get both sides to the table?
I think it's going to happen. I think we've made tremendous progress in the last week. We're dealing with the Russians. We're dealing with the Ukrainians. I think there's going to be something done, I hope.
Zelensky says
you know
that
what,
he's up to doing some equity deal where you get rare earth minerals or something.
Well, I've asked them, look, the United States is in for more than $300 billion, probably 350, and Europe's in for probably $100 billion. We're in for more than twice, maybe even 3 times what they are. This should have never happened. Biden should have never let that happen.
Ukraine, though, you think you can get a deal? Do you keep sending American weapons until you do?
No, what I'm saying is the following. They have tremendously valuable land in terms of rare earth, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of other things. I want to have our money secured because we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. And, you know, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal, they may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday, but we're going to have all this money in there. And I say, I want it back. And I told them that I want the equivalent, like $500 billion worth of rare earth. And they've essentially agreed to do that. So at least we don't feel stupid.
I mean, let me just ask the fundamental question, first of all, here. What does Zelensky think he's going to get for this $500 billion? Because it sounds like Trump's just thinking that's $500 billion for what we've already spent. Like he's just going to take that. But Zelensky seems to be thinking that's going to somehow lead to something else. Do you have any idea what Zelensky's intending?
Well, I think it's implicit in what Zelensky has been saying, and even what Trump has been saying, that we will continue to support Ukraine if they give us $500 billion worth of these critical minerals. That, I think, is what's going on here.
But you see, I thought it was interesting in that interview there when Bret Baier tried to press him on that issue. He said, will you keep giving him all the support until you get what you want from Putin? He wouldn't answer it. He just immediately changed the subject to, no, here's what I'm saying. And so he didn't answer that. Do you think that is indicative of his thought process?
Well, if he thinks that he's going to get $500 billion worth of precious mineral resources from Ukraine and still at the same time be able to sell Ukraine down the river, he's delusional, right? If he's not going to get the $500 billion in mineral resources, but if he were to get it, there'll be a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo will be that we will continue to support Ukraine the way we have in the past. This, of course, is why Zelensky is pushing this idea. Zelensky sees this as a way of continued American support. But of course, it's not going to work because Trump wants out.
And let's look at what happens if Trump let's say that Trump actually went ahead and said, yeah, that's a good deal. I'll take that. So I don't know. You said there's nothing in the cupboard, but I mean, I guess he could just open up the family cupboard, the stuff that we actually need for our security, for our war fighting needs if we had it. And let's just say that for some reason he felt that was okay and he started doing that. But as you said a minute ago, the issue is not so much about ammunition and weapons as about the manpower issue, which Ukraine doesn't have and Russia does. So what happens if Putin politely just declines to make a deal on Trump's terms / Zelensky's terms, and they keep fighting? What is the risk for Trump that he goes down this path and then ends up losing area where these very minerals are located?
I mean, the problem that Trump faces is the problem that Biden faced in Afghanistan. In other words, Trump was the person who decided we were going to pull out of Afghanistan, but he had the good fortune to leave office before we did it. And it was under Biden's watch that we left Afghanistan. And Biden suffered a huge political defeat for pulling out of Afghanistan. And the American public seeing that as a big loss. And Trump's problem here is that if we
new weapons,
lose
thorough training,
Ukraine, which is
well-equipped soldiers,
it's going to be on his watch.
The Russian armed
He's
forces
going to have egg
are
all
back.
over his face. This is a real problem for him. he has to think about how he wants to put an end to
In
this.
2008, the
And
Kremlin
I think
announced
if I
a
had been
far-reaching
playing his
reform
hand,
for the
even
Russian
before I
army,
came into
launching
office,
an
but certainly
investment
after I
program
came
in
into
rearmament and
I would've
modernization
told
of
the whole
over
world I
700
was
billion
inheriting a
euros to
situation
resurrect
where
what had
it
largely
was
become a
clearly
used-up
the case
force.
that we could not win the war in Ukraine and that we were going to lose. And it's not
The
my
collapse
fault.
of the Soviet
It's
Union
Joe
in
Biden's fault. I
1991
inherited
threw
this
the
problem.
Russian military
That's what he
into
should
a
have been
deep
saying.
crisis.
But he didn't say that, and it's now his problem. He has to handle it.
On average,
and
a
he has no
lieutenant
way
earns
of
900 euros a month,
solving
which is not
this
bad by Russian
problem
standards.
of putting an end to the crisis and creating a genuine peace agreement between Ukraine and the West on one side and the Russians on the other. So what's going
The
to happen
Kremlin
here, as we
uses the
said
new
before,
clout
is the
of
war
its
is going to go on.
revitalized armed
The Russians,
forces
I
to
believe, are going to
regain
win
its
an ugly
status as a
victory,
great
and it's
power
going to
on
be
the
a smashing
international
defeat
stage
for both
and
NATO
force
and
through its
President
interests.
Trump.
The annexation
Well,
of the
that's
Crimean Peninsula,
the
the
ugly
crisis
side
of
that
East
possibility.
Ukraine, and
What
the war in
do you think
Syria
President
are just
Trump
a few
can
examples.
do at this point to at least mitigate?
A
I won't even
strong
say
army
get rid of,
is-
but at least mitigate that outcome by having maybe a
Conflict
softer landing,
resolution
if
with
you can
military
use
help.
that analogy.
A prime
I think
example
there's only
is the
one thing you
Crimea.
can do, and that
A
is you
major
can agree
maneuver
to
involving
Russia's
some
demands.
12,000 troops is
But
being
that's
held on the
politically
annexed
unacceptable,
Ukrainian peninsula
certainly.
in
And
the
so how
Black
can
Sea.
you, and if you,
Here,
again, put
in early
yourself, you're in the White House
2014,
now,
the Army
how
first
would you
proved
try
it had
to
regained
have a
its
soft
ability to
landing
take action.
and at least put the best face domestically, politically
Out of the
as you
blue,
can?
Russian
Because you
troops
see
without
there's no
insignia
other outcome. It's
occupied
either
all
really
strategic
up
sites.
or
The Ukraine, the EU, and the USA
I mean,
were
I
all
don't have
taken
a good answer
completely
to
by
that.
surprise.
You know,
Shortly afterwards, the
sometimes
Kremlin
people
organized a
ask
referendum
tough questions,
condemned in the West
and
as
they're
in
tough
breach of
questions because
international
there is
law,
no answer. And there's no
and
answer to your
integrated the
question, in my
Crimea
opinion.
into the Russian
I mean,
Federation.
how would you do it? I mean, if you don't agree to Russia's terms and you recognize the fact that you're going to lose, that the Russians are going to prevail in Ukraine,
Economic
what's the
sanctions
soft
against
landing?
Moscow soon followed, but
I
couldn't force the
honestly,
Kremlin
I
to
would
change
just
course.
be honest and say the outcome that Professor
The Army
Mearsheimer laid
invited
out
Western media
there is
reporters to the
ordained because
peninsula
in
and
the
gave a
ABC
clear
region,
message.
the fundamentals are
Hands off the
irrevocable.
Crimea.
So we're going to do the best thing that we can for the Ukraine side and keep as many people alive as possible. And
We
then
are ready
we're
to
going to get this
repel
war
any
off the
aggression,
table, and we're going to go about
whether by
rebuilding whatever's
sabotage
left
commandos
and ensuring
or
our
any other
security.
party.
I mean, it seems like that would
Foolish
be
ideas can be
potentially
had by many.
I think winning is much too strong a word.
All right,
The
I
Russian
agree.
Army
Winning
has
is
around
too strong a word.
800,000
I can
soldiers
see
in
your point.
active service
You know, as I
and
like
an annual
to often
budget
say
of
when
some
I teach
60
the
billion
students
euros.
that international politics is all about choosing
In the
among bad
worldwide military
alternatives.
strength ranking,
And
experts
I
put
think
Russia's
the
forces in second
policy
place,
you were just
far
putting
behind
forward
the United
is
States.
the least bad alternative.
в Крыму,
But I think
на
it's still a bad
Украине,
alternative.
Yeah,
And
can't
Syria,
really argue with that.
you and I are
в
very clever
обществе
guys,
и в
and we've been
руководстве
studying
страны.
this.
This
issue
has
for
given
a long
rise to
time.
euphoria.
And we have both of us,
Both population
as good
and
Americans,
leadership
have the
believe the army
interest of
is
our
up to any
country at heart.
task.
And the fact is, we just
Россия
can't figure
ввязалась
out
в
how
военное
to do this.
противостояние с Западом.
You know, and
If
come
you
up
add
with
all
some
these
sort of
announcements
soft
together,
landing, to use
you
your
come to
rhetoric.
about 15
Hard
divisions.
to see. Hopefully, it's just
Where are we
a
going to get all
result
the
of the fact
soldiers
that
for
we're maybe
that?
not that smart, and somebody out
army
there
is
can
only
figure
planned
out
to grow
a
by
smart way to
10,000
make
this year.
work.
No, I think we're smart. And whether
Once
Trump
again,
said it or
we're
not, I
forming
think
divisions
what you
on
said
paper.
just a second ago is
Just like
is
the Soviet-
profoundly important.
In
Because
Russia,
we're in
critical
this
voices
position
like
of no
military
good
expert
outcome
Goltz are
because
often
of what
branded
the previous
destructive
administration
detractors.
did, and even before that, other administrations and Europeans
Destination
have done.
Syria.
I mean, let's go
There,
back
the
to
military
late
can again
2013,
demonstrate its
really,
strengths.
and rolling all the way
Mobility,
forward. This
flexibility,
is now where we're at
speed.
because we
In summer
refuse to take any of the
2015,
off-ramps.
President Putin
Many off-ramps
approved
were
the
available.
rapid
Now
construction
that
of an
you've got Trump
airbase
coming in,
near
who's got
Latakia.
such a limited band of
The Kremlin head
ugly or really
successfully
ally.
comes to the
I
aid of
think
his
that's kind of where we
beleaguered
are.
ally,
Yeah,
Syrian
and I would say,
dictator
Danny,
Assad.
we ought to take this back
An
to April
intervention that
2008,
also
when the
takes the
decision was
West
made
by
to
surprise,
bring
maneuvered
Bahrain
himself
to NATO,
into with his annexation of the Crimea.
absorb Ukraine at some point. That was a catastrophic
The
decision.
army as an
One
extremely
cannot
effective instrument of
underestimate
foreign
the
policy.
damage that has been done as a result of that
Russian
decision.
generals
And it's
tried
not
to
only the
deflect from
damage that
this by
has been
presenting
done,
the
it's the
intervention
damage that
primarily
will
as
be
an
done
anti-terror
moving
mission.
forward. The huge blunder.
Yeah, and that's something that it's going to
We are
it's gonna
fighting
take a
against
generation
terrorists.
unwind
IS,
from the consequences of that.
the
Even if
Al-Nusra
we
Front,
get all kinds of smart
and
people in
others.
and start making good decisions now, that's a sunk cost of harm that I think is done that we're not going to be able to unwind.
Russia regards all
without
opponents
a
of
lot of time
Syrian
going
ruler
on.
Assad as
No,
terrorists.
no argument for me.
Spearheading the
I
fight
wanted to
against
say,
them
I
is the
agree with you
Sukhoi fleet of
100%.
combat jets. Old
Well, but
and
it would
new
be good
models
if we
working
stopped
hand in
doing that
hand.
and stopped building up, future payments. In the last amount of time we have here, I want to shift gears a little bit to the Middle East because
The Kremlin
we're
chief
coming up on a
believes
potential
Syria
problem
is an
this
ideal
weekend,
training ground for his
where
military
Trump
machine.
has kind of changed the terms of the
And they are
ceasefire that had been
particularly
negotiated with
proud
Qatar
of
and
the
several others.
Su-34 fighter bomber.
This three-phase ceasefire, which was supposed to end the
After
fighting
launch,
completely, but
the
now that
air-to-ground
Trump has set a
missiles
new
are guided
condition
precisely
that
to
if
their
all of the
targets
hostages
to
are not
within
back
half a
by
meter.
noon on Saturday,
It's also
then, quote,
equipped
all
with
hell is going to
air-to-air
break
missiles.
loose.
This aircraft
what do
is
you
a
see
complete
happening with that
all-rounder.
situation?
Well, I don't know for sure.
The heavy
I think there's
Su-34
some
tactical strike
possibility
fighter
that
has been in
Hamas
series
and
production
the
since
Israeli
2006.
government will
It's armed with cruise
settle
missiles
their
and
differences
autocannon,
before Saturday.
guided and unguided bombs.
I'm not saying that
and has
is
a
going
maximum
to happen.
weapons
I think
load
there's
of
some
8,200
I
kilos.
say that because it's very clear that Hamas wants to make the ceasefire work. No question there.
The Russian
And
Air Force has
although
at least
there's
85
a lot of evidence that
Su-34s.
Netanyahu doesn't. The fact is that he has powerful incentives to make this work, at least for the time being, so that he gets more hostages out. My guess is that at the start of the ceasefire,
Recognizing
there were
weaknesses
98
and eliminating them.
hostages,
In the eyes of the military, the
being
Syrian
held
campaign
by,
is ideal for this
Hamas,
too.
and a good number
In
of them,
combat,
30
the
plus, I think,
Sukhois
were
can
dead.
best show where
But anyway,
improvements
of the
need to be
98,
made.
as best I can tell, 16 have been taken out. Okay?
Human rights
16 have been
organizations
taken
like
out.
Amnesty
And that's
International
16 out of
accuse
98.
Russia of
That tells you there are a lot
indiscriminately
of
bombing
hostages
civilians as
there.
well.
And Netanyahu has
The
a
army
deep-seated
deny this
interest in getting
and speak
most,
of
if not all,
anti-Russian
those hostages
propaganda.
back. So if the fighting
Significant
starts up
progress
again
has
on
been made in
Saturday, a lot of
communications
hostages
and
will
reconnaissance,
remain stuck
which is of
in
great
Gaza, and
relevance
that's
for
not
the
in
Syrian
Netanyahu's
war.
interest.
These tanker
Furthermore,
trucks are
What
allegedly on
exactly
their way
are the
to
Israelis
Turkey.
going to do if the ceasefire breaks down? They spent about 16 months pounding the
We
living
can see
daylights out of the
precisely
Gaza
how much
Strip.
oil the terrorists
There's
are
not much
producing
left to
and selling to
destroy.
the smugglers.
They didn't destroy
They use that money
Hamas. Hamas is
subsequently
alive and well.
to carry out attacks
So what are they going
all
to
over the
do
world.
after Saturday when they restart the war that they couldn't do in those 16 months? Do they now have a war-winning
In
strategy?
Syria, Russia
I think
is
the answer
expanding
no.
its Latakia
So
air base.
I don't understand
The Kremlin
what they
expects their
gain,
involvement to be
by
long-term.
restarting the war. And again, the whole hostage problem is staring Netanyahu in the face. So I think an argument could be made that you'll get a deal, some sort of deal before Saturday. I may be wrong.
To
who knows
protect the
for
troops
sure,
and
but if
the
you
Air
don't get a
Force,
deal,
the Army is
apparently the
deploying
Israelis
its
are gonna
best
go
air
back
defense systems.
funding Gaza.
Most notably, the
Where that
S-400
leads,
Triumph.
I don't know. It's
This
not
system
gonna
can
lead to
intercept
any
fighter
kind of
jets,
victory
cruise
by the
missiles,
Israelis.
short and long-range missiles in
and,
all weather conditions,
So
and
they'll
at
just
virtually
end up in the
any
same place they
altitude.
were in on January 19th when
Russia
the ceasefire
moved
started.
the S-400 to
Yeah.
Syria
Well,
after
I
Turkey
guess we'll have to
shot
see
down
how
a
that one
Sukhoi
plays out. Last
24
question
at
I
the
have.
end of
One of
2015,
the other things that
claiming that the Russian
President Trump
bomber
has
had
floated
entered Turkish
is to
airspace.
provide a
With the
good
aid of
place
this
to
air
live for all these
defense system,
Palestinians while
Russia
this-
can
this strip is
establish a
rebuilt.
no-fly zone
And
over
we're going
large
to all
parts
what
of
that
Syria
may
at
mean,
any
in
time.
terms of people coming back or so. That we could do a whole show on that. But I do want to zero in on two particular issues. Do you think there's any prospect
The possibilities
that
the
Jordan
S-400
and Egypt
offers
either
are
will
colossal.
Or can
It can
absorb
track up to
large
300
numbers, not
targets
just token small
and
numbers, but large
simultaneously
numbers
engage
like
36.
900,000 each personnel. Will they ever take those people into their countries?
I don't think so.
Maximum range,
I think it's
400
quite
kilometers.
clear that every Arab
Maximum
country,
interception
indeed every
altitude,
Arab and
27
Islamic country,
kilometers.
is adamantly opposed
Short,
to
medium,
a
and
ethnic
long range.
cleansing policy
And depending
that
on the target
results
and
in
the distance,
Palestinians
different
being
missiles
displaced
are
to,
deployed.
Jordan and Egypt. And King Abdullah, the head of Jordan, made it clear yesterday
With India,
he was not
negotiations are
going to go
ongoing,
along with
and
this
Turkey
scheme
has
of
also
President
expressed its
Trump.
interest.
And the Egyptians have also
I'm
made
quite
it
sure
clear.
it will be a big seller,
In
just like the
fact,
S-300.
General El-Sisi, who was supposed to come to Washington to talk to Trump, canceled his trip.
As
So
even
they're not
Kremlin
gonna
critical
willingly
military
accept that.
experts in Russia
Now,
admit
it is
the S-400
theoretically
is very
possible
probably
that
the world.
the
A
Americans
statement
and
was
the
made declaring that
Israelis
any
operating
no-fly
as a
zones
tag
established by
team
the
will
S-400 would not be
ethnically
tolerated.
cleanse the 2.3
But what can they do
billion
about it?
Palestinians in Gaza
In the
at
Balkans,
end
on the
of a
Crimea,
rifle barrel.
in
It's
Kamchatka, or
theoretically
even in
possible.
Syria,
I
the
do
de
not
facto
think it's
existence of
practically
no-fly zones
possible.
has already
I
been
find
like
it
this.
hard to
Western
believe that the
jets
United
risk being
States
shut
would
down at any
actively
time once
participate
they
in
venture
such a
within the
morally
operational range of the
reprehensible
S-400.
policy. I think the
And
Israelis
right next to
would
it
do it.
is its little
But
brother,
even there, I
Pantsir.
think a lot of pressure would be brought to bear on the Israelis not to
Our air
ethnically
defense system.
cleanse Gaza at the end of the rifle barrel. So my sense is that
The
for
Pantsir's
foreseeable
range is
future,
between
the
1 and 20
Palestinians
kilometers.
will remain in Gaza.
The system is
And in
equipped
the
with
West
2
Bank. But at the
autocannon
same
guns
time, there's
and a
no
total of
question
12
the Israelis
anti-aircraft
will
missiles.
constantly be looking for opportunities to cleanse those two parts of Greater
Russia
Israel,
also has a
so that
very
they can
efficient
move away
anti-ship
from the
weapons
present
system
situation,
deployed in
which is
Syria.
one where
But he
Israel is
mentioned-
an apartheid state, to one where there are hardly
On top of
any
this,
Palestinians
there's also the
in their
fact that no
midst,
ships
and
will be
therefore
able
they
to approach the
obviate
Syrian coast.
the apartheid problem.
They will be prevented from doing so
That's,
by the Bastion
There's a
complex.
lot to unpack there, but we'll leave it there for the time
Its
being.
operational
And, we'll
range
continue
covers
to
an
monitor the
area of
situation as
150